Please teach us to wait well. Teach us how to trust. Teach us how to remain true to you even when all of our circumstances might feel so uncertain. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Waiting. If you have grandchildren or little children, you know that's a very difficult concept for them. But it's also a difficult concept for us often as adults. We might talk to little children about patience and waiting and deferred gratification and so forth. But the reality is, as adults, we often struggle, and it becomes a faith issue of how we struggle. How do you wait? Are you the sort of person who gets frustrated or irritated when you have to wait? Maybe you are able to accept waiting and you just roll along with whatever is happening. It seems that the faster things get, the more impatient we become. The other day I dropped into Tim's nursery and picked up a couple of plants, and there was the young fella there was serving, and he went to print off the receipt, and he said, I don't know what's wrong with this. It's a brand new printer. Can't believe how slow it is. And we sort of laughed and we said, 5 years ago we would be saying, aren't these printers incredibly fast? But as things move on, we then become more and more impatient. Patience. Thank you very much. I just need the little circle. There we go. I saw Mr. Bean and I thought, I've just got to put him in. This is one of Bev's heroes. She thinks Mr. Bean is such a hunk of a man. She says, why can't you look like Mr. Bean? Oh, pardon? Oh, the people at home aren't getting the pictures. Oh. They're waiting. Tell him to turn on his computer. They are getting it? Waiting. This is hilarious. We're just going to take 20 minutes of waiting and then, we got to go. Let me know when it comes up. Do you remember if those of you who used to watch Mr. Bean when our kids were sort of teenagers, we'd watch Mr. Bean, and there was a funny one of him racing off to work, in his little mini miner, he had to unlock it, and he hops in and he's cleaning his teeth as he's driving along and he's getting dressed and all of this. And we were pulled up, I was driving them to school, and we pulled up the traffic lights, and on the road there at the lights, here's this bloke getting dressed and doing all kinds of things, and they're all laughing, saying, there's Mr. Bean, there's Mr. Bean. We're right? Okay. We stop waiting. Excellent. So this morning, as we practice waiting, that was a really good little interlude. I'm going to talk about, to start with, a book that I did at high school called Waiting for Godot. And I gave Kerry the heads up on this, and I said, this time I'm going to talk about Godot. I'm not going to talk about and use the word Alexander Solzhenitsyn because she'll have to spell that long word. So I'm not going to talk about Alexander Solzhenitsyn for you. You can say rude things. So for those of you who haven't read the book or watched the play, there we go. It's a really simple play. So there's this very simple scene. It only has 5 actors in it. There's not much to see apart from a tree. And there are these 2 characters, Vladimir and Estragon, and they meet at this tree which doesn't have any leaves on it. And they start talking and just interacting. And Estragon talks about how the fact of the night before, some people bashed him up and left him, and he spent the night lying in the ditch. And he gets up, and so they just talk backwards and forwards about what is happening. And then they discover that they are both waiting for this person by the name of Godot. And they that gives them this common point. But they've never actually met Godot, and they're not quite sure who Godot is, and they're not quite sure whether Godot will turn up or not. But they keep talking, and so it's just this scene gathered around this fairly dead tree. And then 2 more people turn up. This fairly wealthy, pompous aristocrat by the name of Pozzo, and he brings along his slave who's called Lucky. I'm not quite sure that Lucky feels he's very lucky. And so Lucky has a rope around his neck and Pozzo drags him along, and Lucky's carrying all the heavy bags. And so after a little while, they move on. And then a little boy turns up and he brings a message from Godot. And he says to these two, Vladimir and Estragon, well, Godot is not going to come tonight. He may come tomorrow. And then that's the end of scene 1. And then when we get to scene 2, all that changes is that there's a few leaves now on the tree. And so a little bit of time has passed. And Vladimir and Estragon are still sitting there waiting for this unknown character of Godot. And then Pozzo and Lucky arrive. And by this time, Pozzo is blind. And so he's dependent on Lucky, his slave. But Lucky is mute and he can't speak. And Pozzo goes into this fit of despair and he just lies down and moans and groans. So from becoming this wealthy person, life has become so unpleasant for him. And then and then they both say to Vladimir and Estragon, we've never met before. And the two old blokes are saying, no, we just met the other day. And they're saying, we don't know who you are. And then the boy turns up and he thinks he's never met these two old men before. And he says, by the way, Godot is just not going to turn up at all. And so this whole play is this sense of meaningless and hopelessness of people waiting. And one of the most telling sentences, and I still remember it from high school, so that's 75, 80, 90 years ago. Pozzo gives this really vivid description. He says they give birth astride a grave, light gleams in an instant, and then it's night no more. And so what he is saying is, that's life. From darkness, a flash of light, bang, and then you're in the grave. And there is not much more to life than that. Now that's a very dark view of life, isn't it? And Beckett, who wrote the play, describes it. He says, nothing happens, nobody comes, nobody goes, it's awful. And so he wrote this in, I think, the 1950s, not late 40s, 50s. And in one sense, Beckett is trying to describe how many human people view life. We're here on earth for a little while, we wait around, we fall off the twig, we cark it, we die, whatever we use, and that's it. And so then you have to start questioning, well, why do we wait? What's the purpose of waiting? And so for some, it may sum up life. But for Christians, we need to be asking the question, as we wait, why do we wait? How do we wait? What are we waiting for? And so as we lead into December, into Advent, and so Advent is about arrival, appearing, waiting, expecting. I thought we'd do a series around waiting, and we're going to be thinking about a whole lot of verses in the Bible that talk about waiting over the coming weeks. But the thing is, for us, is we are not waiting for Godot, the unknown or the unknowable, but we are waiting upon God. We're not just waiting for God, but we are going to see how we wait upon God. And so that changes how we wait. Just think of how much waiting we've done over the past 18 months with COVID. There's been a lot of waiting that goes on. They say, we'll be out of lockdown in a month, and then it gets extended by a few more weeks, and or people go into isolation, or kids go back to school, and then they come out into isolation. And so there is lots of waiting. For some, you've been waiting to go on holidays, you've been waiting to travel, you've been waiting to get back to work, you've been waiting to travel interstate, you've made numerous bookings to go to certain places and they had to cancel those bookings. So life, there's been a lot of waiting. For some of you, you've been just waiting for some news. Maybe you've waiting, the sense of waiting when you go to the doctor and get tests, and then you have to wait, and it might only be for a few days, but you're still waiting. How do you wait? What goes on inside of you when you wait? Now, many times we think waiting is just wasted time. I've really been struggling for the past 18 months or so that in a lot of ways I feel these past 18 months for me anyway in ministry and church has been wasted time. It's not been what I'd planned. And so when we go into these times of hibernation or waiting, it can feel like wasted time because they are the times when nothing happens. We are sitting around a tree waiting, wondering what is going to happen. But even in the times when nothing seems to be happening, we discover a lot of things have been happening. And one of the things that we'll be seeing hopefully over the next few weeks is that in those waiting times, we sometimes waste them. Because of our attitude, we are just grumbling about waiting time. And in the waiting times, God actually may be teaching us faith lessons about waiting and about trust and about faith. I want to come this morning to this story, which is all about waiting. It's a parable. It's a story of servants waiting for their master. But to see the story, we just need to put it in a little bit of context. So the gospel writers, when they put together their books, sometimes they just wrote sequentially what Jesus gave. Sometimes they gathered bits and pieces to create the environment and the story. So they might be from different times. But this is the context that Luke sets. Firstly, he's saying to those who follow him, he says, you need to be on your guard against the Pharisees. So he's calling out the religious people who talk, but they don't actually put into practice. They talk about God, but they aren't really having faith in God and trusting God. Then he talks about the need to have faith. He talks about acknowledging me. He says, anyone who acknowledges me before others, the Son of Man will acknowledge him before the angels of God. So we need to have faith. Then he goes on to the story of the rich fool. And really at the heart of it, the rich fool is his sin isn't because he's wealthy, but his sin is because wealth is his idol. So he's building this massive kingdom around his possessions and his bank balance, but he is poor toward God. And then following up, he says, straight away from the rich fool, he says, therefore don't worry. You know, we've all got to eat, we've got to dress, we've got to have jobs, we've got to have homes. That's part and parcel of life on earth, of physical life. But he says, your Father knows these things, but he says, seek God's kingdom. So he says, if you trust in me, you will have this different mindset, that you will have this kingdom focus. And then he comes to this story in the midst of all of this waiting, uncertainty and anxiety. Be ready for service, be dressed and ready for service, and keep your lamps burning as though you were waiting for your master to return from the wedding feast. Then you'll be ready to open the door and let him in the moment he arrives. And so one of the lessons Jesus is trying to get across here is that waiting is part and parcel of being a follower of Jesus. Waiting, there are these times of waiting. Life includes waiting. Everyone has to wait, but for Christians, how we wait should be and can be different. Now, let's just understand a little bit of what's going on. Why is this story significant? So if you were there in the first century listening to this story of Jesus, a whole lot of images would be coming into your mind, and they are foreign to us. If you were a young man, fell in love with a girl from down the road or the next town, you would have a ceremony where what we would call you would get engaged, and then you would go back to your parents' place, to your father's home, and you would say to your bride-to-be, I am going to prepare a place for you. And when that place is ready, I will come back and take you that you might be with me. Does that sound familiar? John 14. And so he goes back to his father's place and he builds the home that they are going to live in. But he can't cut corners because Dad is watching. And he cannot go to bring his bride to the unfinished home until Dad checks it all out and approves, and he says, yep, this is a suitable place for you to bring your new bride. And so then he says, now you can go off. And so he rushes off to get his bride, and as he approaches, he would blow the ram's horn, the shofar. But then the bride and her attendants would need to be ready. Remember the other story that Jesus told of the 10 virgins who are waiting? That's what they are doing. They are waiting for the bloke to rock up and start, let's go. So there's this, and so we're not used to that kind of stuff, do we? Then they all go back to the father's place, and then the wedding celebrations take place for 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. And it's into this context that the master has gone. Now, for most of us, we couldn't cope with that, could we? We have diaries. I have a paper diary. I have about 3 electronic diaries that are all hopefully synced. You know, we've got to keep checking. Oh, yeah, I can't do that. When people are getting engaged, they're giving notices, 12 months ahead, keep this day free because, we plan to get married on this day, and then they've got to juggle stuff. They didn't work like that in Jesus' time. It was sort of this thing. It just happened. And everyone had to be ready. Why do we need our diaries so much? We have busy lives. But you feel in control when you've got your diary, don't you? You say, this is my life. This is how I've planned my week. Oh, I can do this and I can't do this. No, I can't meet with you for coffee on this day because I've got 6 different things on, and we show that because it looks really impressive. And then there's a little slot here we can fit you in. They didn't function like that. And even some societies, cultures today don't function like that at all. But the Bible is all about people waiting and people trusting. Oh, seized up again. Waiting. There we go. Let's just think about the people who waited in the Bible. Remember Abraham and his wife? They childless and they struggling with that, and then God appears and he says, hey, guess what, Abraham? Or to Sarah, you're going to have a son, child, and he's going to be a son. Wow, how great. Imagine waiting 25 years for that to happen. That's a long time to wait and to keep on trusting. Or Joseph, when he was taken off to Egypt, somewhere between 13 and 25 years before he saw his family again. He waited and he never wavered in his faith. God had made this covenant promise to Abraham that I'm going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey, your own land and so forth, but you're going to be in Egypt for a little while. Well, the little while happened to be for 4 centuries, a bit over 4 centuries, 430 years. They waited and they kept believing in this God who was going to deliver them and fulfill this promise. Or Moses. Moses goes and is raised in the richest palace in the world at that time, was given an incredibly important job as CEO, well-paid job, highly recognised, big profile, and then God says, okay, that's enough. Now you're going off into the desert and you're going to become a shepherd, just looking after sheep. And so there's that change, but he still waits, and eventually God pulls him back and then uses him. Or think about the people in exile. When God said to Benjamin and Judah, because of your disobedience, I'm going to send you off into exile and I'm going to bring you back again. That's okay. But you'll be away for 70 years. several generations. And so they kept waiting and they kept believing and they kept trusting God, and God fulfilled his promises. Or think about the great big gap between the end of the Old Testament in Malachi and Matthew, and it appears nothing happens. And people are waiting and they are waiting and they are waiting for this promised Messiah. You know, we think Advent. We slot in 4 weeks for Advent. They sort of had 400 years of waiting and anticipating and expecting. And they are described as the silent years because there's no revelation of God. There are no books that we can read. God didn't speak in that time. There is silence. But there is this waiting. Or finally, think about John the Baptist and Jesus. Right from their birth, for both of them, their mums knew that they would have a significant mission and role to play. But they waited for 30 years. We don't know what happened pretty much in those 30 years. They're born, and then 30 years later they arrive. Times of waiting are times of faith. And so it's in that context that Jesus tells this story. And so there is this wedding that the master is invited to. So I guess he didn't have a whole lot of warning because of how the wedding systems worked. He hadn't put it in his calendar. His mate, who was probably the father of the groom, would have rung up or sent him a text message or somehow and said, hey, by the way, a couple of days' time, we've got a big celebration. My son's getting married. We want you to come along. And he has to give up a whole week for this. Can't clear his calendar. That's just what you do. And so he heads off, and in one sense, he leaves all of his servants in the lurch. Now, if you were a servant, what would you be doing? Maybe you would say, wow, isn't this great? We can chill out a little bit. We can take it easy because he's not watching us what we do. And normally it's, 5, 6, 7 days, toward the end of the time, we'll suddenly clean up the place and get ready. Some might have got frustrated and thought, well, it's time for us we're heading off and we're going to party for a while. Some of you might have thought, well, let's raid the cellar. Let's raid the pantry and let us have a party. While he's partying, we'll party too. And we'll just have a big clean up before he arrives. But they don't seem to be like that in Jesus' story. There seems to be this respectful relationship between the two. They trusted their master and he trusted them. And so Jesus portrays them as these good servants who just go about doing all of the things the master expected. If he had his little camera monitoring what was going on, he would have just seen them and he would have thought, well, yeah, that's just what I knew that they would be doing. And so they just went about life as they normally went about, even though he were not present. They didn't work or do special things to get approval. They just did what was expected of them. And then when the master returns, there's no shock, there's no surprise. And he's able to say to them, well done, good and faithful servants. But in Jesus' story, there's this twist. Because the master comes from these days of celebration, and what does he do for his servants? You would expect in the story that he would come and he would kick off his sandals and he'd say, oh, I need a bath. Will one of you run me a bath and wash me? I'm tired. I just need a little snack and I've got to recover for a few days. Keep quiet, everyone. But in the twist of the story, the master calls his servants. Now, the servants presumably would eat outside somewhere, but I visualize when it says, and he makes them recline at table, he makes them recline at his table. And he puts on a banquet for them, and he serves them, and he blesses them. Now, they haven't done anything special. They've only done what was in their job description. They've done that well, but that's all they've done. And yet, they are the ones who normally serve him, but he says, I want to serve you, and I want to bless you. I think Jesus is giving a picture to us, isn't he, of what he is like. I came not to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus in this story is gathering all of these themes and images that were so familiar to people, and they keep popping up in the Gospels and again in the book of Revelation. The bride, the groom, the wedding, the celebration, waiting, anticipation. All of these things are present in this story. And so while it's this first century human story, it's more than that. It's this deeply spiritual story that Jesus is trying to get across to us. And then he says, verse 40, you also be ready, because the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. He starts off, be ready for service, just go about your service. And then he ends the story, you also be ready, for you do not know when the Son of Man is coming. Now, at one level, you can say, well, this is a story about the time when Jesus will return in the future. But I think it's also a story about, in the intervening times, of always being ready. Year after year, month after month, just us keeping on doing what we are doing. Jesus wants us, in our waiting, to stay faithful and to be ready. We often look for the spectacular and the peaks and all of these, and Jesus is simply saying, just do the ordinary things, but do them well and remain faithful and true and reliable and dependent. I love that title of one of Eugene Peterson's book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. I think that sums up the Christian life. It's not a sprint, but it's this long, long journey to whenever the end may be. It may involve lots of periods of waiting. But the waiting then takes on a different context when we understand God who is in control of things. Vladimir and Estragon were waiting and struggled in their waiting because in the absurdity of the play, they didn't even know this character Estragon. They didn't know what his character was like. They didn't know whether he's worth waiting for. They didn't even know whether he would turn up or not. But Christian waiting is different. Elizabeth Elliott, who had lots of hardship in her life, and I came across this quote which is great. She says, waiting on God requires the willingness to bear uncertainty. That's why we find waiting so hard. We can't live with the tension. We want certainty. We want answers. We want to know what's going to happen. So waiting on God requires the willingness to bear uncertainty, to carry within oneself the unanswered question. So when we're waiting, we do have questions. It's okay to have the questions. And lifting the heart to God about whatever intrudes upon one's thoughts. And so it's living with the tension of uncertainty, but a God who is certain, of living with the times of waiting and not knowing how long we will wait. And so waiting can be these times of creating trust and enlarging our faith. We are waiting for Jesus to return, but the whole of life is a period of successive times of waiting. They might be just for days, might be for hours, maybe for months, maybe even for years. For different things, we have to learn to wait. Waiting sometimes can be difficult because it tests our faith. But we need to keep reminding ourselves we are not waiting for the unknown Goddo. We are not waiting for the unreliable Goddo. But we are waiting upon a God that we know, upon a God that we know who is reliable. As in Isaiah 46, it's a fantastic chapter, it says that God knows the end from the beginning, and he declares that my purposes will stand and what I have said will come to pass. You see, that's a God who is sovereign. That's a God who is in control. And so when we need to keep reminding our little brains that as we wait upon God. What are you waiting for? I'm sure that there are things that you're waiting for. How are you processing that waiting? Are you anxious or are you frustrated about waiting? Or are you waiting upon the Lord? Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. Amen.